Sometimes Magic makes creatures whose stats are based off the game state rather than being static, and these creatures have an asterisk to denote their power changes. Today we're going to go over the best cards in Magic with this kind of dynamic stat line. Starting us off at number 10, we have the Allosaurus Rider. This is an elf warrior with a mana cost of 5 and 2 green. It has the ability where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control plus 1. And it also has the ability where you can cast it by exiling 2 green cards from your hand rather than paying its mana cost. Now, Rider isn't that great of a creature, as it's a bit difficult to use. 7 mana for what should be an 8/8 with no other abilities isn't that great, and going -2 to cast a medium-sized creature is usually a bad idea. However, there are ways to make better use of this card. For example, there's a card called Neoform that allows you to sacrifice a creature, then search your library for a creature card with a mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature card's mana value, put it into the battlefield with an extra +1/+1 counter on it, then shuffle. Since this card only costs 2 mana, you could sacrifice a Rider to find an 8 mana value creature on turn 2, or on turn 1 with the help of a card like Chancellor of the Tangle. This was the basis of a somewhat short-lived modern combo deck called Neobrand. What the deck aimed to do was use Neoform Rider with a Grizzlebrand, a massive 8 mana creature with crazy abilities where you can pay 7 life and draw 7 cards. Then you would use Nourishing Shoal to exile Autocathon Worm to gain 15 life for 0 mana, allowing you to draw through your entire deck. Then the deck would play Simian Spirit Guide to make the extra mana they would need to close out the game, usually ending on a Thassa's Oracle, a creature which enters the battlefield trigger wins you the game if your library is empty. Now, this deck hasn't been successful ever since Spirit Guide was banned, as they can no longer make the extra mana they need. Still, the deck did put up some results when it was legal, and Allosaurus Rider was a key part of the deck strategy. And at number 9, we have Pack Rat. This is a rat with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of rats you control, and it has the ability where you can pay 2 and 1 black and discard a card to make a creature token that's a copy of Pack Rat. This is a member of an entire archetype of cards of Magic, specifically rats, whose power and toughness are each based on how many other rats or copies you have of that card. Often, these cards have the ability specifically that allows you to play any number of copies of the card in your deck. Pack Rat is an interesting inversion of this idea, where a single copy is an entire swarm of rats all on its own. Pack Rat doesn't need any other rat cards in your deck to be good. A single copy can easily turn into a huge board with just a little bit of time. One thing that makes Pack Rat so good is what Magic players call the threat of activation. This means that your opponent always knows you can activate Pack Rat and has to play around it. They have to assume that your Pack Rat can grow by making more rats, which can change combat math or change if they want to use a burn spell on it. Not only that, burning a removal spell on it while your opponent has open mana is often the wrong play. Your opponent can simply make another rat in response, and while they do have to discard a card to do so, turning bad cards in your hand into a real threat on board while your opponent is also burning one of the removal spells is a real pain. Pack Rat can often just run away with the game if you don't kill the turn after it comes down. Your opponent could just keep making rats, and you never really want to remove it because you're not really dealing with the problem, just setting them back a bit. You kind of need a board wipe to actually deal with the Pack Rat. Now, while this card is really good in the long game, most formats have gotten too fast for the rat. It had a very successful run through Standard, but it hasn't seen too much success in formats like Modern since then. Modern has quite a few decks that can kill you on turn 4 or faster, so Pack Rat doesn't have enough time to become the threat it could be in most games. And at number 8, we have Anax, Hardened in the Forge. This is a demigod legendary enchantment creature with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red. It has 3 toughness and the ability where its power is equal to your devotion to red, which is the number of red mana symbols amongst permanents you control. It also has the ability where, whenever Anax or another non-token creature you control dies, you create a 1/1 satyr creature token with this creature can't block. And if the creature that died has power 4 or greater, you make 2 of these tokens instead. Anax is an incredibly powerful aggro creature. Lots of aggro decks want to spend the first couple of turns just casting cheap threats. This means that your devotion to red will often be around 4 on turn 3, and on your next turn, Anax can easily attack for 5 or more damage. On top of that, giving you tokens whenever one of your creatures die makes your deck a lot more resilient. One of the best ways to beat aggro decks is to wait for them to overextend and then use a board wipe to leave them empty-handed. While losing your whole board of actual cards is still very bad, getting a board full of attackers allows you to push for extra damage that can really matter for an aggro deck. Anax's ability to push through a ton of damage and make your deck more resilient made it a great inclusion for all kinds of red aggro decks in its standard format, though it hasn't seen much play in older formats. And at number 7, we have Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. This is a legendary human knight with a mana cost of 1 and 2 white. It has the ability where its power is equal to the number of creatures you control and has 4 toughness. It has vigilance, meaning attacking doesn't cause it to tap, and finally, it has the ability where, whenever you attack, for each opponent, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. Adeline is a great threat for white decks. Unlike a lot of other creatures, Adeline can actually put out extra damage the turn she comes down. Getting a single 1/1 every turn can really add up, especially since Adeline's power can grow extremely quickly. White aggro decks specialize in swarming the board with lots of cheap threats, especially tokens. Adeline herself is able to make tokens to help you swarm the board, but there are tons of other white cards you can run alongside Adeline to boost her power further. Though, one of the things that makes Adeline so strong is that while she can be made extremely powerful with other cards, she works fine on her own. If you attack with just Adeline, you'll make a 1/1 and have a 2/4 Adeline with a 1/1 token, meaning you're hitting for 3 damage, which is at least okay for a 3-drop. On your next turn, however, you'll hit for 5 damage, and then 7, and so on as Adeline builds up a board for you while also getting stronger. Another great thing about Adeline is that having exactly 4 toughness makes her way more resilient. Lots of Red's best removal spells deal exactly 3 damage, so having exactly 4 toughness lets it dodge some of the really important removal spells. All in all, Adeline is just a really efficient threat that's great at putting out damage, and as a result, Adeline has seen a fair amount of play in Standard and Pioneer aggro decks. And at number 6, we have Crackling Drake. This is a Drake with a mana cost of 2 blue and 2 red. It has 4 toughness, and it has the ability where its power is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile, plus the number in your graveyard. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying or reach, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. If you're wondering why it counts a number in exile as well as in the graveyards, in this set, the Izet Guild has a mechanic called Jumpstart that allowed you to recast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard by discarding a card, but you had to exile it afterwards. This way, Drake gets bigger when you jumpstart cards as well as when you cast them from your hand. Anyway, Crackling Drake is a really good mid-game threat for a Spellslinger deck. These decks are more than competent at filling their grave with instants and sorceries quickly, so Drake will usually be at least a 4/4 when it comes down, if not bigger. A 4-mana 4/4 flyer that draws you a card is pretty above rate, but the fact that it keeps getting bigger as the game goes on makes it go from good to great. These types of threats that replace themselves when you play them are really hard to deal with for a lot of decks. You'll pretty much have to 2-for-1 yourself to kill it, so if you're a deck that really cares about card advantage, you really don't want to see a Drake come down. This made it a great threat for Izet, or blue-red, aggro and mid-range decks in multiple formats. The card has seen play as far back as Pioneer, though in that format there are some cards that give it a run for its money. And at number 5, we have Master of the Etherium. This is a Veldalkin wizard artifact creature with the mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has the ability where its power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts you control. It has the ability where other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. The ability to get a huge creature while also pumping your entire board is really strong, and the only restriction on the card is needing you to play a decent number of artifacts and artifact creatures. Luckily for the Master, there's an archetype in Modern called Affinity for Artifacts, named after the Affinity mechanic. This is a mechanic that makes a spell cost 1 less for each artifact you control. This made the strategy of just spamming as many artifacts as you could a very powerful strategy in formats like Modern. Affinity decks played a bunch of cheap artifacts like Memnite, Vault Scourge, and Springleaf Drum to fill the board and power up their affinity cards or their cards that synergize with artifacts. For example, Master of Etherium. It was pretty common to have a 6/6 or 7/7 Master extremely easily. On top of that, Master can make your entire board bigger, meaning that this card can add up to 10 damage to the board. Getting all this for just 3 mana is a great deal, so it's no wonder why the card has seen so much success. While the card did used to see a ton of play, it hasn't been played in the last few years. The main reason for this is that Affinity decks have been changing their game plan quite a bit over the past few years. First, it pivoted to Hardened Scales variant, and now has pivoted towards the 8-cast variant. Neither of these versions of the decks are interested in Master of Etherium, and without Mox Opal, the old variants of Affinity are a bit too weak to see played in Modern nowadays. And at number 4, we have Territorial Kavu. This is a Kavu with a mana cost of 1 red and 1 green. It has the ability where Territorial Kavu's power and toughness are equal to the number of basic land types amongst the lands you control. It also has the ability where, whenever Kavu attacks, you choose 1. You either discard a card, if you do, draw a card, or exile a target card from a graveyard. As it turns out, it's pretty easy to get Kavu's power and toughness pretty high. Not only do you have fetch lands that can help you go find lands with other basic land types, but recently Wizards released the Triomes. These are lands that enter the battlefield tapped, can be recycled for 3 mana, letting you discard them and then draw a different card. But most importantly, they have 3 different land types. Of course, this means you can find them with your fetches, but having lands that provide 3 different colors of mana and count for 3 land types for domain makes getting all 5 land types out way easier. This made domain decks far better in formats like Modern, and Kavu is a great 2-drop for the deck. Not only is it just a huge beater, but its attack trigger can be helpful in a lot of situations. Being able to cycle cards in your hand is always useful, as it's pretty easy to draw a dead card in the late game, and replacing it with a better card can save you in a lot of tight spots. And exiling cards from the graveyards can help against a ton of decks that rely on cards in your graveyard. All of this has led to Territorial Kavu seeing play in domain zoo decks in Modern, and putting up solid results in that format. And at number 3, we have Voice of Resurgence. This is a 2/2 elemental with a mana cost of 1 green and 1 white. It has the ability where, whenever an opponent casts a spell on your turn, or voice dies, you create a green and white elemental token. with the ability where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. Voice is a very strong 2-drop, being able to get 2 or more for ones very easily. There are tons of decks that really get punished by Voice, as tons of decks can't play without being able to cast spells on your turn, and your opponent never wants to give you an extra token, as these tokens are extremely valuable. If your deck is built to flood the board with creatures, it's pretty easy to make a token that has at least a 4/4, if not bigger. Even if your opponent can get around not playing on your turn, making the token when it dies as well makes the card good against almost everything. Aggro decks don't like the 2 blockers it gives you, and mid-range and control decks hate having to deal with the second threat. No one wants to tap out for a big Wrath, knowing that your opponent is just going to make a token right after. The card's main home has been Winota decks and Pioneer. These are decks that want to play a bunch of cheap non-human creatures to cheat out big humans off the top of their deck with Winota's ability. Voice fits right into these deck strategies. The deck is a mid-range deck that also threatens to combo off, and Voice is a great mid-range piece that can also be used to let Winota spin out humans. And at number 2, we have Cultivator Colossus. This is a plant beast with a mana cost of 4 and 3 green. It is the ability where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It has trample, meaning it can deal combat damage to a defending player or planeswalker while attacking. It also has the ability where, whenever it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, and if you do, draw a card. Then you can repeat this process. This is a crazy strong card if you can cast it. As long as you keep playing lands, you can keep drawing off its ability. All these extra lands will pump up the Colossus' power, making it an even bigger threat. While this on its own is strong, the decks the card is played in have made this ability even crazier. Amulet Titan decks are built around getting out incredibly powerful lands into play. Their win condition is Volakut the Molten Pinnacle, a land that deals 3 damage to any target whenever a mountain enters the battlefield, if you control at least 5 other mountains. Volakut is crazy strong, and Colossus' power to allow you to play a ton of lands obviously synergizes extremely well with it. However, the synergies go deeper than that. Amulet of Vigor is used to make a ton of mana in the deck, and its ability to untap your tapped permanents also applies to lands that Colossus plays for you. This lets you refund a ton of mana you spend on Colossus, and sometimes will actually let you get even more mana, allowing you to make another big play right afterwards. And since you'll have to run out of lands to play after drawing off of Colossus, you'll definitely have some spells to cast at that point. All this together has made Colossus one of the most powerful and heavily played cards in this list, but I think everybody knows who's going to take the top spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Tarmogoyf. This is a Lyrogoyf with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It is the ability where its power is equal to the number of card types amongst cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. And for anyone who doesn't know, the card types are land, creature, artifact, enchantment, instant, sorcery, planeswalker, and tribal. Tarmogoyf is an extremely famous magic card, seen play for years in tons of different decks. It may seem a bit difficult to get so many card types in the graveyards, but it's actually quite simple. Fetch lands are very common, so they should be at least 1 land in your graveyard. Then if you leave with something like a Thoughtseize on turn 1, you can get a card out of your opponent's hand that likely won't be a sorcery, putting a total of 3 card types in the graveyards. Or, for that turn 1 play, you might do something like play a removal spell on your opponent's creature, putting 2 different card types in the graveyards that way. All this is to say that Tarmogoyf is at least a 3/4 most of the time, and usually only gets bigger. It often gets to be a 4/5 or even a 5/6 by the end of the game. While this card doesn't have any other abilities, being this big of a threat for just 2 mana is enough to make the card an amazing threat. This has made Tarmogoyf one of the premier green threats in Magic, seeing play in literally every format it's legal in. Now, most people familiar with the game will tell you that Goyf's power level has gone down quite a bit recently, and it's not the card it used to be. There's just way stronger cards to play than there used to be. This is very true, but it's worth noting that despite this, Goyf is still seeing its fair share of play. This is all just to say that the card has gotten much worse and sees less play than it used to, but it's still putting up some results, showing you just how good the card has been historically when it was by far the best fair threat in the game. Tarmogoyf is just by far the most successful and iconic card with a star stat line, and there's no other card that could possibly be the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other good cards I may have missed or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.